I was alone, in darkness. I didn't know where I was or how I got there. Everything was black, but a blackness so deep and intense it felt almost physical. And I had to fight the urge to collapse, to fall upon the ground and curl myself into the fetal position and shut my eyes. Shut my eyes? Were my eyes even open? I reached up and touched them. Yeah, they were open. And no, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then I reached down and touched the ground, and my hand felt stones, small rocks which had a greasy texture. I moved my hands a little farther, a little further, and found I was now touching a long wooden board, wooden plank. And then it hit me. It was a railway tie. I was standing on a railroad track. Sure enough, I felt around until my hand touched a cold steel rail. I realized I must be in a tunnel or subway, although I couldn't remember how I got there. And frankly, my primary thought was, how do I get out of here? I waited for my eyes to adjust to the intense blackness, but they didn't. I couldn't see anything at all. It was like I was dead. But then, off, in the distance, at the very limit of my vision, I thought I saw a pinprick of white light. I wasn't sure at first if my eyes were playing tricks on me, if I was seeing things. Perhaps the incredible darkness was causing spots to form before my eyes. But no, there was a light. White. Faint. I could see it now. The mouth of the tunnel? An exit? I started walking slowly forward, my eyes straining, focusing on the distant circle of illumination. It was hard to keep track of time in that total darkness, but I must have walked for about 5 minutes, keeping my eyes on the little white spot, which gradually became larger. I must be getting closer, I told myself. And that's when I thought I heard voices. They were faint, as if they were far away, or as if they were talking in whispers. Who could it be? But then it was so dark. There could have been an army present, and it would have been impossible to see them. But how did I get here? I slowly began to remember. We were cruising around in a car, contemplating heading for Niagara Falls and maybe going over the river to the States. I think there was 4 of us. Yeah, there was 4 of us. Madman Marty, who was driving. Jason, man of few words, riding shotgun. And me, in the back, with Natalie. I'm sure I was only there because of Natalie. But I don't remember what happened after that. I became aware of a faint sound in the distance and saw that the light appeared much closer. And then I felt the vibrations underfoot. No. I reached down and touched a steel rail to find it shimmering in my hand. Shimmering! The white light wasn't the mouth of the tunnel. It was the headlight of a locomotive. The light was getting bigger and brighter, and now I could definitely hear the sound of the approaching train. I had to get away or find someplace safe to hide. I stepped off the track and smacked into the tunnel wall. The walls seemed to come within a foot of the line of track, not really leaving me enough space for me to lie prone. I'd have to find a nook or recess in which to take shelter. They had to have some, right? For the protection of the maintenance workers? And then the train sounded its horn. The noise seemed to explode in the confined space, and I saw to my horror that the train, was now closer, much closer, and as it roared towards me, the light began to illuminate the tunnel walls, and they were totally smooth, no sign of any openings in which to hide. The white light seemed to hang in the darkness now, as if it was stationary, not moving. But all the time I knew it was roaring down on me. I was buffeted by an infernal wind, the roar of the approaching locomotive filling the narrow space, and then the horn blared again, so loud it almost knocked me off my feet. I realized the train would be upon me in seconds. I threw myself down in the narrow space between the wall and the tracks, pressing my face into the ground as the wind whipped around me, choking me with dust. At the last instant, I could bear it no longer, but turned and looked up. A huge, silvery white light loomed over me, enormous and blinding. Was I actually under the train? Was it going to run over me? And then... I came to and found myself in a tunnel. Natalie was there. "Where are we?" I asked, totally bewildered. "You know where we are, silly," she answered, laughing. "No, really." "We're in the Blue Ghost Tunnel, asshat," Marty shouted in his booming voice. "You ought to know. It was hard enough getting in here." Then it did all come back to me. We had been cruising around when Marty got the bright idea of doing a little urban exploring in the Blue Ghost Tunnel. The real name of the Blue Ghost Tunnel is the Meriton Tunnel, and it was built from Queenston limestone back in 1875 to allow trains to pass underneath the third version of the Welland Canal. 107 men died during construction of the 700-foot tunnel, including a 14-year-old Irish boy killed by a falling limestone boulder. On January 3rd, 1903, 2 trains collided in the tunnel, killing a pair of firemen. So the tunnel was considered to be badly haunted by all who had died there. It also apparently had a spectral blue ghost. A spectral blue ghost, hence the nickname. We had a heck of a time finding the place, which was off an abandoned road, slipping and sliding our way through a series of narrow paths until we reached the entrance, all of us covered in mud. The door-sized gateway to the interior of the tunnel was ajar, and so we creaked it open and entered. After listening to see if we could hear anyone else inside, but all we could hear was the steady drip of water. Marty had brought an industrial-sized flashlight, while the rest of us used the lights from our phones. We moved forward slowly, oppressed by the malodorous atmosphere. "Hello!" Marty roared, his loud voice echoing in the confined space and almost making me drop my phone. "Don't do that, man," I complained, which spurred Marty to add, "Any ghosties here?" "Ah, shit," I said. Marty turned and shined his big flashlight in my eyes. "What's the matter, bro? Scared?" I didn't answer him. Asshole. Then Natalie came over to me and said quietly, "Don't encourage him." And then she took my hand. She took my hand, and it was okay. I was surprised at the well-preserved condition of the track bed, seeing the tunnel had been last used in 1915. But the walls were covered in graffiti, testifying to many visitors, some of them, probably, scarier than any ghost, while the high ceiling appeared to have been reinforced against collapse. Against collapse. In other words, the tunnel was no place to hang around. We could hear water over the sound of our voices, a dripping cascade which grew increasingly louder until Jason the Sphinx finally turned and spoke, for the first time all night. "We can't get through. There's lots of water coming through the ceiling, and the place is flooded." "Where's all this water coming from?" Marty asked. "We may be under the old canal, and it's seeping in from there," I said. Marty was close enough to me I was able to see him shrug. And then his light went out, plunging us into darkness, but for the feeble lights from our phones. "Hey man, don't do that," I yelled. "I'm not. The fucking thing cut out on me," he yelled back. And in that instant, my phone died, and so did my light. Natalie grabbed me, crying, "My phone's dying!" And then Jason's died too. And we were underground, in the dark, in a tunnel, and a long way from the entrance. We stumbled along in what we hoped was the right direction, away from the falling water. We had come at night, so, of course, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. But once again, Jason spoke. "I see a light." Down the other end of the tunnel, the far end, the wet end, opposite the direction in which we were walking, was a pinprick of white light. Was somebody else exploring the tunnel? From the other end? "Hello! Hello!" I yelled, only to hear my voice echoing back to me, followed by the blare of a railroad engine. A train was coming down the track. But that was impossible. No trains had run through the tunnel since 1915. But one was coming through now. The light was getting bigger and brighter, and we could hear it chugging along. We were all running now, Natalie holding my hand, but then I suddenly tripped and lost her, falling to the hard, wet ground. I turned and looked up. A huge, silvery white light loomed over me, enormous and blinding. Was I actually under the train? Was it going to run over me? And then... I was alone in darkness. I didn't know where I was or how I got there. Everything was black, but a blackness so deep and intense it felt almost physical. and I had to fight the urge to collapse, to fall upon the ground and curl myself into the fetal position and shut my eyes. Shut my eyes? Were my eyes even open? I reached up and touched them. Yeah, they were open. And no, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then I reached down and touched the ground, and my hand felt stones, small rocks which had a greasy texture. I moved my hand a little farther and found I was now touching a long wooden board, wooden plank. And then it hit me. It was a railway tie. I was standing on a railroad track. And then I knew. I was dead and condemned to this tunnel, this underground world for ever? Was I the blue ghost haunting the Meriton Tunnel? Would I ever see Natalie again? Natalie? Did she really exist? To paraphrase the old country song, it's enough to make my ghost eyes blue. Mark believed he was falling in love with Helen. He had several classes with her, and, when not in class, found she was constantly in his thoughts. She was a striking girl with a pale, pretty face and large gray eyes, which looked directly at you when she spoke, and she wore her thick, honey-brown hair piled atop her head, completely different from the other girls. Helen dressed casually but with a certain style, and wore square-toed boots, tight jeans, and a dark vest over men's dress shirts. And she was both intelligent and witty, and best of all, seemed to find Mark interesting. They had a class together on Friday afternoons, and afterwards, Helen, Mark, and some of the other, scholars went to the Brock University pub for a brewski. On this particular Friday, Mark sat next to Helen, and they had an animated discussion about some Harold Pinter plays they were reading for their modern theater class. And as they were leaving, she asked him if he would like to join her and some friends on a trip over the river. Over the river. Now, to a Brock student, going over the river meant a tour of the watering holes of western New York, where booze was cheap and the bars stayed open late, i.e., like until 3 o'clock in the morning. He said yes, of course. Mark was ecstatic at being invited. But his enthusiasm dimmed soon after Helen picked him up in her Nissan Rogue. Problem 1. Helen had 2 other guys in tow. One was an African exchange student named Darwin, who never opened his mouth, and the other was an obnoxious guy named Kev, who never shut up. Mark's relationship with Kev started out like this. Kev, loud. You're a drama student, eh? Mark, yes. Kev, that's kind of for losers, eh? Mark felt like saying, if that's true, how come you're not a drama student? But instead he said, I find it interesting. Things went downhill from there, made worse by Kev drinking from a crock of Jack Daniels. Drinking from a crock of Jack Daniels in a moving vehicle heading toward an international border. Lovely. Just fucking lovely. Problem 2. They were no longer going over the river. Instead, they were heading for the Screaming Tunnel. The Screaming Tunnel. The Screaming Tunnel was in Thorold or Niagara Falls, depending on your source. It was a limestone drainage tunnel running under a rail line, built sometime in the 1800s. It was called the Screaming Tunnel, as a young woman, fleeing a fire in a nearby farmhouse, ran into the tunnel, her nightie ablaze, and died screaming in agony right in the middle. They say if you strike a match on the spot she died, you'll hear her scream. But no word if the trick would work with a Bic lighter. Other versions of the story ran, A. Girl was the victim of incest, and her father set her clothes on fire when she threatened to go to the police. B. Father burned the house down after losing custody of the children during a nasty divorce. Girl managed to escape, only to die in agony. C. Girl was raped and murdered in the tunnel, and her body set on fire to destroy the evidence while she was still alive. All in all, the legends were pretty distasteful. Mark had heard them all, of course, but he had never wanted to visit the spot, and he didn't want to visit it now, at least not with this crew. But Helen wanted to go, and with a Ouija board to try and contact the dead girl. Mark didn't believe in the supernatural, and he also felt screwing around with a Ouija board was kind of juvenile. But he was stuck now. Unless he wanted to make the long walk back to his lonely room. The tunnel was just off the side of a quiet road in an isolated, semi-rural, semi-industrial area. And unfortunately, the place was deserted, as Mark had hoped they might give up if there were other people hanging around. No such luck. The place stank like shit. And naturally, no one had thought to bring a flashlight, so they had to use the lights from their phones to guide them. And they needed the light, as a stream of smelly water ran right down the middle of the subway. In fact, it was so damp, Mark wondered where Helen was going to set up the Ouija board. They made their way to the midpoint of the tunnel, the spot where the young woman allegedly died screaming, the spot where striking a match would make the girl's ghost begin screaming anew. Of course, Kev had to try it, striking his way through several matches before he got one to stay lit. Nothing happened, but Mark was surprised the flame didn't cause the putrid miasma or the fumes from the jack to explode. Eventually, Helen got the board set up, and she knelt along with Kev and Mark, and the three of them put their fingers on the movable planchette. But not Darwin, who stood a foot away from the board, either from fright or disinterest. Helen asked the standard question first. "Is there anyone here?" The planchette moved to yes. Kev leaned over to Mark and, blowing whiskey fumes in his face, said, "You're moving it." Helen shushed him, then asked, "Did you die in a fire?" Again, the planchette moved to yes. "Were you murdered?" Yes. By now, even Kev could see the planchette was clearly moving on its own accord, and he told Helen to ask the spirit who killed her. "Who murdered you?" The movable disc began to move, and spelled out H-E-L. No, Mark said instinctively as the planchette continued to spell out E-N, Helen. They all looked at each other as Darwin slowly began to back away. And that's when the screaming started. The smell hit them first, the acrid aroma of burnt meat. The darkened archway of the tunnel was suddenly filled with a blaze of yellow-orange light as a giant flame appeared at the far end of the underpass and actually began to move towards them. It was a young woman, arms raised as if to embrace a lover, and she was on fire and shrieking like a banshee as she ran forward. Mark heard a sharp intake of breath, and turning saw Helen. Saw Helen was also on fire, and had started running to meet the burning girl. Mark looked to the others for help, but Darwin had already taken off, and Kev was standing like a statue and filming the scene with the camera on his iPhone. God! Oh, God! He kept repeating over and over. God! Oh, God! Mark jumped after Helen and threw his arms around her, planning to take her down and hoping the damp, dank earth would help him put out the flames. But the instant he grabbed her, Mark suffered a violent shock, his eyes blinded by intense, reddish light, and his flesh seared with agonizing pain. And then it was over, and he was holding Helen tightly, and she was no longer on fire, and the burning girl had vanished. Yet the screams still echoed in the tunnel, and they could still smell the stench of charred flesh. They were alone. After a minute, Mark said, "Are you all right?" "Yeah," Helen answered weakly. "Let's get out of here." They found the road where they'd parked it. Both Kev and Darwin had completely disappeared. "Are you okay to drive?" Mark asked. Another week. Yeah, I'm okay." They drove back to town in silence, and from time to time, Mark caught a whiff of cooked meat. But he kept his mouth shut and said nothing, not even when Helen dropped him off. Alone in his room, Mark lit a cigarillo and smirked as he poured himself a shot of, Fireball. And as he sat and smoked, he thought about Helen and how his prospects for romance appeared to have gone up in, flames. Ha, ha, ha. But Mark was sure as to the reality of the screaming girl. The sounds, the smell, the heat had all been real, and he was equally sure Helen had been a pillar of fire until he took her in his arms, when he too had felt the burn. He poured himself another shot and said, out loud, "Guess you shouldn't screw around with spirits and Ouija boards." Mark was right about his romance. It was over before it started. He continued to see Helen at school, but they didn't sit together anymore and didn't speak beyond the occasional hello. She left at the end of the semester, and he never saw her again. But several years later, when Mark was having a quiet beer at a local bar, a guy at the end of the counter kept staring at him and finally said, "Your name is Mark, right?" Turned out it was Kev. "Thanks for taking off that night," Mark said testily. He had no interest in renewing his acquaintance with Kev. "I've never been more scared in my life," Kev said, without the least hint of embarrassment. But you want to know the worst part? The worst part of all? Not really, Mark said, planning to drink up and go. You saw how I was filming everything. With my phone, eh? Yeah. Well, when I went to look at it later, there was nothing there. No girl, no flames, no screaming, nothing, just us guys yelling. Nothing. But there was a burning girl there. I saw her. Shit, I smelled her. And Helen, she was on fire too. It couldn't have been a hallucination, eh? Mark got to his feet, shrugged, said, I don't know. Then Kev concluded, Guess you shouldn't screw around with spirits or Ouija boards, eh? Indeed. Yeah. Let the dead rest in peace, unless you have a burning desire for paranormal enlightenment. WSJ here. Thanks for listening. I lived in the Niagara region for 4 years, but never heard about the Screaming Tunnel until I moved 2,000 miles away. I guess that shows the power of the internet. As for me, on this channel, I write and tell original Canadian weird tales and creepypastas. If you enjoyed this video, please share, comment, I'll answer, drop a like, and subscribe for more horror and horrible puns. And I really appreciate the support of all my wonderful subscribers. And remember, never screw around with spirits or Ouija boards. Stay hungry.